We are walking into a place so bright that night never quite arrives. Billboards the size of buildings pour color onto wet pavement, and on a busy day, some 360,000 people cross this pavement with us. Yet little more than a century ago, this was a dim district of horse stables and carriage shops on the edge of the city. One newspaper, one subway line, and one glowing ball changed everything. Tonight we walk Times Square in the rain and trace how a horse market became the crossroads of the world. Times Square is not actually a square at all. It is the stretch of Midtown Manhattan where Broadway slices diagonally across 7th Avenue, roughly from 42nd Street up to 47th. That crossing leaves two long triangles of open pavement, so from above the whole place looks like a bow tie. The southern triangle carries the famous name, while the northern one is officially Duffy Square. Tonight we will walk the full bow tie in the rain, under about 100 giant screens. A light rain is falling, and it turns out to be a gift. Every crosswalk becomes a mirror, doubling the neon above it, red and teal and gold running together in the puddles. The crowds have thinned but never vanished, because this intersection simply does not empty. Yellow cabs hiss past on wet asphalt, and the food carts glow like small lighthouses. It is the best possible weather for seeing what all this light actually does. The reason this place exists at all is the street under our feet. Broadway began as the Wickwastic Trail, a footpath worn through the woods and brush of Manhattan by the island's native inhabitants long before Europeans arrived. Dutch settlers widened the path into the main road of New Amsterdam and called it the Herenstraat, the Gentleman's Street. The English later renamed it Broadway, simply because of its unusual width. Every landmark we pass tonight stands on the shoulders of that ancient road. When the city imposed its famous street grid in 1811, the old road refused to conform. Broadway kept cutting diagonally across the new avenues, and every place it crossed one, the collision left an open wedge of land. Union Square, Madison Square, Herald Square, and this one, each a scar where the ancient trail meets the modern grid. Open land in Manhattan is rare, and open land attracts light and crowds. That accident of geometry is why the screens tower over us right here, and not one block east. Before the lights, this was Longacre Square, and it smelled of hay and harness leather. By 1872, the name was in use, borrowed from Longacre in London, and the parallel was deliberate because both districts were centers of the horse and carriage trade. Stables, blacksmiths, harness makers, and carriage showrooms lined these blocks at what was then the raw upper edge of the developed city. William Vanderbilt ran the American Horse Exchange here, where fine animals were auctioned to the carriage class. It was useful, unglamorous, and after dark it had a genuinely rough reputation. The horse district did not so much vanish as transform, building by building. The clearest symbol is the American Horse Exchange itself, whose site was rebuilt in 1911 as the Winter Garden Theater. A hall that once rang with auctioneers selling carriage teams became a stage that would one day host shows like Cats and Mamma Mia. As automobiles arrived, the carriage trade collapsed, and entertainment moved into the vacuum. In one generation, the square traded hoofbeats for footlights. You can still read that history in the side streets around us. The theaters mostly hide their bulk mid-block, showing the square only a bright marquee, the way carriage showrooms once showed a fancy front over a working stable. More than 40 Broadway theaters cluster within a few blocks of where we are walking. The rain deepens the colors on every poster and sign. This district was rebuilt for spectacle, and it has never once been rebuilt for calm. The first man to bet real money on entertainment here was Oscar Hammerstein I, grandfather of the famous lyricist. In 1895, he opened the Olympia, a huge entertainment complex on Longacre Square, when this neighborhood was still considered too far uptown for a respectable audience. The gamble eventually broke him financially, but it worked as prophecy. Other producers followed him north, and the theater district took root around the old horse market. The stage was set literally for what came next. Stand here and turn in a slow circle, and you are looking at the most valuable advertising real estate on the planet. These wraparound screens are direct descendants of a decision one newspaper publisher made more than a century ago. He was looking for attention, for circulation, and for a piece of land that the whole city would have to pass through. He found this triangle, and he gave the square both its name and its most famous night of the year. In 1903, Adolph Ochs, publisher of the New York Times, began building a new headquarters on the narrow triangle at 42nd Street. The Times Tower opened on January 1, 1905, a slender 25-story campanile rising 363 feet from the street. When it opened, it was the second tallest office building in the city, behind only the Park Row building downtown. Its basement connected directly to a brand new subway station, so the paper could move print and people with equal speed. It was a lighthouse of news planted in the middle of Broadway. The name changed before the tower even opened. On April 8, 1904, Mayor George McClellan Jr. signed the resolution renaming Longacre Square as Times Square in honor of its incoming tenant. That October, the city's first subway line opened, with a station here bearing the new name, stamping it onto every map and every rider's daily route. A rival paper, the Herald, had gotten the same treatment at Herald Square a decade earlier. The horse market was gone from the signs forever, traded for a newspaper masthead. That slender tower still stands at the south end of the square, though you would never recognize it. Today it is wrapped almost completely in electronic billboards, a building turned entirely into a sign. Somewhere behind those screens is the steel frame Ochs built, and on its roof, the flagpole where the most watched 60 seconds in America happens every December. We are walking past it right now. Nearly everyone looks up. Ox understood promotion the way other men understood printing. To celebrate his new tower, he threw an enormous New Year's Eve party on December 31st, 1904, crowned with a rooftop fireworks display over the square. It worked spectacularly, pulling the city's midnight crowds away from their traditional gathering at Trinity Church downtown. The fireworks returned the next 2 years. Then the city stepped in, because burning ash was raining down on tens of thousands of upturned faces, and the show was banned. Ox needed a bigger spectacle that did not set anyone on fire, and his chief electrician pointed at an old maritime tradition, the time ball like the one dropped daily on the Western Union building downtown. A sign company called Artcraft Strauss, led by a Ukrainian-born metalworker named Jacob Starr, built the answer. It was a sphere of iron and wood, 5 feet across, weighing 700 pounds, skinned with 100 incandescent bulbs. On December 31st, 1907, 6 men hauled it up a 70-foot flagpole by rope and lowered it at midnight. The ball drop has happened almost every year since, missing only 2 wartime New Years. Tonight's version of that ball is 12 feet across and weighs nearly 6 tons, dressed in thousands of Waterford crystal panels and lit by computer-controlled LEDs. About 1 million people pack these blocks to watch it fall, with 1 billion more on screens around the world. It is strange and wonderful to stand here on an ordinary rainy Tuesday, sharing the space with a fraction of that crowd. The confetti is absent. The light, however, never leaves. The Times itself outgrew the tower quickly and moved to bigger quarters on West 43rd Street in 1913. But the paper left its mark on the building one more time. On November 6, 1928, election night, a ribbon of thousands of flashing bulbs began crawling around the tower's base, spelling out headlines in moving light. New Yorkers called it the Zipper, and its first bulletin announced Herbert Hoover's victory over Al Smith. For decades, crowds gathered here on momentous nights to read the news written in light bulbs, long before anyone imagined carrying headlines in a pocket. The Zipper's descendants are everywhere around us tonight. Stock prices, sports scores, and breaking news still crawl in bands of light around these buildings, just faster and sharper than in 1928. The square has always been a place where the city comes to read itself. Election nights, moon landings, and midnight countdowns all drew their crowds to this pavement. The habit is a century old and clearly not going anywhere. Broadway's most famous nickname was born just before the Times arrived. In February 1902, a newspaper headline in the New York Evening Telegram read, "Found on the Great White Way," and the name stuck to this glowing stretch of the street. The white came from early incandescent bulbs, which blazed long before colored neon existed. In 1904, the square's first electrified advertisement went up on the side of a bank at 46th Street and Broadway. Advertisers discovered what Ox had discovered, that this bottleneck of humanity was the best audience in America. Here is the quirk that separates Times Square from every other district in the city. Almost everywhere else, zoning laws limit how big and bright signs can be. Here, since the late 1980s, the law actually requires them, and new buildings on the square must include large illuminated signage to preserve its character. The glow we are walking through is not just commerce, it is mandated. Times Square is perhaps the only place where a developer can get in trouble for being too dim. The giant animated signs even earned their own name, Spectaculars. Their greatest showman was an Alabama-born ad man named Douglas Lee, who treated the skyline as his personal theater. His most famous creation was a Camel cigarette billboard that blew giant smoke rings, made of steam, drifting out over the street for more than 2 decades. He floated steam clouds above a giant coffee cup and set a penguin blinking in lights for a cigarette brand. Long before television, this square was where American advertising learned to move. At the north end of the bow tie, we reach Duffy Square, named for Father Francis Duffy, the heroic Army chaplain of New York's fighting 69th Regiment in the First World War. His statue has stood here against a Celtic cross since the late 1930s, watching the brightest lights in the city. Behind him rise the famous red glass steps above the TKTS booth, which has sold discounted same-day Broadway tickets on this spot since 1973. The steps glow from within, like a small grandstand facing the show that is the square itself. On a rainy night, they shine like a ruby. The 1920s were the district's first golden age. Dozens of theaters blazed within a few blocks, premiering the work of the Gershwins, Rogers, and a young lyricist named Oscar Hammerstein II, carrying his grandfather's Gamble forward. Movie palaces joined them, grandest of all the Paramount with its glowing globe and clock tower on Broadway. Restaurants, roof gardens, and dance halls filled the side streets. For a few electric years, this was simply the entertainment capital of the earth. The square's single greatest night came in August 1945, when word arrived that Japan had surrendered and the Second World War was over. An estimated 2 million people flooded these blocks, the largest crowd in Times Square history. Amid the celebration, a photographer caught a sailor kissing a nurse in the middle of the street, and the picture became one of the most famous images of the century. During the war, the great signs had been dimmed against the threat of air raids, and the new year had been marked with a minute of silence and recorded chimes. That August night, the lights roared back. Looking around tonight, at families taking photos at 11 p.m., it is hard to imagine this place as dangerous. But the square's story is not a straight climb. The Depression emptied the grand theaters, and many survived only by turning to cheap movies and dime museums. The district's glamour faded decade by decade after the war. By the 1970s, Times Square had become a name parents said with a warning attached. From the 1960s through the 80s, these blocks were infamous for peep shows, adult theaters, and grindhouse cinemas, with crime rates among the worst in the city. In 1981, Rolling Stone called West 42nd Street the sleaziest block in America. The old movie palaces ran exploitation films around the clock behind crumbling facades. Yet even at bottom, the crowds never entirely stopped coming, and the ball still fell every New Year's Eve. The square was down, but its lights stayed stubbornly on. The turnaround, when it came, was fast enough to give the city whiplash. In the 1990s, state and city programs took control of the decayed theaters on 42nd Street, and new policing pushed crime sharply down. Corporations that had fled the square came racing back. Walking here now, past renovated marquees and flagship stores, the transformation reads as complete. Critics sometimes mourn the grit, but few who actually lived with it do. The symbol of the comeback was a single theater. The New Amsterdam, an Art Nouveau masterpiece from 1903 that had once hosted the Ziegfeld Follies, sat rotting with mushrooms growing in its orchestra pit. Disney signed on to restore it, spending tens of millions, and reopened it in 1997. Soon after, The Lion King roared onto its stage, and families filled a block their parents had crossed the street to avoid. One restored theater flipped the reputation of the whole district. Notice what we are walking on right now, because it used to be a traffic lane. For most of a century, cars and pedestrians fought for this bow tie, and the people were losing. The sidewalks of the square carried crowds the size of a small city squeezed onto narrow strips of concrete. Tonight we stroll straight up the middle of what was once Broadway's roadbed. That is the most radical recent change in the square's history. In May 2009, Mayor Michael Bloomberg's administration closed Broadway to cars from 42nd to 47th Street as an experiment. Traffic engineers predicted chaos, but injuries fell, foot traffic rose, and businesses thrived. In 2010, the change was made permanent, and over the following years, the temporary paint and lawn chairs were rebuilt into sleek granite plazas. A square that began as a horse market, then became a traffic jam, is now finally what its name always promised. It is a place to stand still. The scale of this place tonight is hard to hold in your head. Around 360,000 pedestrians pass through on a busy day, well over 130 million people a year, more than the population of Japan. The Old Times Tower stands almost entirely empty inside, yet earns tens of millions of dollars a year from the billboards wrapped around it, a building whose only job is to glow. Advertisers pay handsomely for a single screen here, because this remains the best lit stage on the planet. We end where the lights begin to thin, looking back at a glow the color of every era at once. Tonight we walked an old native trail turned Dutch High Street, a horse market turned theater district, a newspaper's triangle turned the crossroads of the world. Times Square has been glamorous, notorious, and reborn, and through all of it the ball has kept falling and the lights have stayed on. The rain is easing, and the neon is still doubled in every puddle behind us. Thank you for watching. Follow for more of the trails of the world.